Chapter 10. Out of a Fairy Tale. Growing up near a large forest had taught Jack how far was too far to explore before it was time to turn around. You'd think it would be common knowledge, but it had taken his mother a near run-in with a bear to learn it as a child, and then it had taken him a near run-in with a pack of wolves when he didn't listen to her. Thankfully, the two of them managed to stop Emily from completing the trio. But Jamie's dowsing rod only crossed towards the shadows in the woods, so, against Jack's better instincts, deeper and deeper they went. Jamie had wanted to keep holding his hand, but because he needed both of his for dowsing, Jack kept a hand on Jamie's back instead. Though Jamie tried to act confident, Jack could still feel him tremble every now and then. It made Jack's heart ache. He hated how helpless he felt. He'd set out to protect Jamie from the dangers that came with magic, but in the end, all Jack could do was rub comfort in circles in his back, training his own ears on every rustle he heard. At one point they came across an old hazel tree, and Jamie picked up a new dowsing rod off the ground, foregoing the two bent ones in favor of the traditional forked branch. Their course remained the same, but it brought up a welcome new topic of conversation outside of their current predicament.
"Different types of trees come with different magical properties," said Jamie. "Rowan is the best for fire and protection, while hazel is the best for water and dowsing, and you can also use it for divvy."
Jamie looked up in thought, blowing through his lips.
"Future vision. That sounds cooler anyway."
"Huh, I've never heard of them being used for that," said Jack. "I just know rowan berries are good for stomach problems, and hazel's good for circulation."
"Where did you learn that?"
Jack tensed. This would be the first time he talked about his family in years, ever since he left home. But Jamie wasn't shaking for the first time since they'd found out they were trapped. If it helped him to talk, I knew a doctor," said Jack. His mother's face flashed briefly in his mind before he could stop it. He ignored the pang in his heart and forged on. "We were close, and sometimes she'd ask me to forage for plants when the apothecary was out of stock."
"Is that how you knew you didn't have a fever?"
Jamie grinned. "Is that how you knew you didn't have a fever?" Jack stuck his tongue out and blew a raspberry. He smiled when Jamie snickered. At least he was getting him to laugh again. Yes, actually, that was part of it.
"What was the other part?"
"My animal instincts." Jack growled and tickled Jamie's sides, making him squeal. He stopped when he almost got hit with the dowsing rod. "But you clearly know all about the magical side of things." Jamie blushed.
"Not all of it."
It looked like Jack had stumbled upon a source of pride. He grinned, putting his hand on Jamie's back again. "Then tell me what you do know." Jamie went on to list more examples of different trees and plants, pausing every so often to adjust their course whenever the dowsing rod dipped up or down. He was probably better to stay quiet, but talking was helping to distract Jamie, so Jack made sure to keep asking him questions while they searched the woods. He did his best to listen to Jamie as he kept a lookout, but one thing did stand out in particular.
"That's why I told you to come meet me by the hawthorn tree."
That caught Jack's attention. He thought back to the woods surrounding his home and all the trees around the lake. There was always one type more abundant than the rest. "My village is named Hawthorn, after the trees." Jamie perked up.
"Where is your village?"
"On the other side of the mountains, by the lake." Jamie nodded.
"That makes sense."
"Does it?"
"Hawthorn trees are the most closely related to the fairy realm and, well, you know."
Avalon. A harsh gale flooded through the trees, stirring even the mists around them, and the forest came alive with chatter as it passed through the leaves. Jamie gasped and dropped his dowsing rod, hugging Jack's side, his hands clutching the fabric of his shirt. "Hey, it's okay. It was just the wind." He let Jamie recover, gently stroking his hair. "There you go. Are you okay to keep going?" Jamie nodded, and Jack picked up his dowsing rod for him. "So, why are you only learning 3 types of nature magic?" Jamie swallowed.
"They're the ones my mentor knows best. Water, fire, and air are the simplest forms of their elements, too. Earth is more complicated, because it's tied to so many other things. Trees and flowers, soil and grass, stone, and so on."
He took a few shaky steps forward before setting into an even pace.
3's a good number in magic, though. A lot of important stuff comes in 3s, like the 3 realms. Sea, earth, and sky.
He was being so brave, and Jack felt a swell of pride for him. He made sure to stay a little closer next to Jamie as they walked deeper into the woods. So far, whatever was with them in the other world hadn't found them. He hoped it would stay that way. Hiccup was starting to doubt that Toothless was trying to find a source of water. Logistically, they should be heading downhill, but Toothless kept making detours, climbing up onto rock ledges and plateaus, only to jump back down again a few minutes later. Sometimes he would catch a scent, or his ear fins would perk up at a noise, and he'd change course yet again. At this point, Hiccup couldn't tell if he was tracking something or just exploring. He also wasn't responding to Hiccup's questions. That eventually turned into pleas, and he had no choice but to stay put in the saddle and be taken for the ride. He kept a lookout for animals that might lead them, but the woods were still strangely empty tonight. He wondered if it was because they seemed to be in some sort of magical section of it, or if it was because he was hanging around with the dragon. Both were likely to be true. His best bet was looking for any large groups of alder or willow trees that would grow near a body of water, but it was hard to discern the differences in the dark. Hang on. He did see something. A few feet in front of them, the image of the forest seemed to waver as if it was the air of a hot summer's day. Hiccup tilted his head to the side and caught a subtle shimmer from the moon reflecting off the shape. As they got closer, the mist around it parted in two, and the bottom of the shape lit up until the light was nearly blinding. No, wait, that was just Toothless. He was breathing a column of fire on the ground below the shape, and the light from the flames overtook the shimmer from the bottom up until it vanished from sight. All that was left was a large burned divot in the ground, still smoking around the edges. Hiccup groaned, throwing his hands in the air.
Right, of course. Can't forget to leave evidence. We've been a little too stealthy.
Toothless shot him a side-eye before he continued onward.
Hang on.
Hiccup pointed a thumb behind them.
You missed the other two lines for the arrow pointing to us.
All he got was a grumble in response. Jack kept an eye out for any shimmer in the air or any glow that passed in the mist, but there were no signs of rifts in the veil around them. If anything, the woods were getting darker the further they walked. The number of glowing plants and wisps slowly grew thinner until they were all but out of sight, leaving only the ever-present mist, its ethereal quality taking on a menacing air. Jack asked Jamie if this was normal, or if it had something to do with whatever was keeping them trapped in the other world.
It's hard to say for sure, Jamie answered. The veil is unpredictable, and magic beings all have the ability to influence it. The more powerful they are, the more influence they have. It's really about who wants to see and who wants to be seen.
Jack hummed. Seems like the veil favors magical beings over humans a lot. Jamie nodded before letting out a yawn. Is it past your bedtime? Jack teased.
Maybe.
Jamie yawned again, rubbing his eyes.
Maybe not. Time passes differently in the other world.
Wonderful. More, please. I was just starting to feel like I knew what was going on. We can't have that. And so they walked on. Jack wasn't sure how much time was passing. The subtle glow of the mist made it hard to tell if the shadows were growing longer. Every time he checked the moon and the sky, it hadn't changed positions. It was almost disorienting looking at the stars, which somehow felt both impossibly close with how bright they shined, and even further away into the endless reaches of the sky, the dark space a rich velvet in between. His only indication that it was getting late was by how much Jamie's eyelids were drooping. Eventually he offered to give Jamie a piggyback ride when his head began to nod, and Jamie sleepily instructed him on how to douse before climbing up, resting his chin on Jack's shoulder. Jack hooked his arms under his legs before picking up the rod, and away they went.
Can you tell me a story?
Jamie asked after a while. Oh no, you gotta stay awake, remember?
A really short one can't hurt. You can tell me more about you, so you don't have to think.
I know that, Jamie yawned.
Thoughts are hard.
Thoughts are hard. Jack adjusted his hold on Jamie, making sure to jostle him. Jamie laughed, only to yawn again. Only if you trade me some too. Can't have you dozing off. Jamie readjusted himself on his back.
What do you want to know?
For starters, how did you get involved with magic? Seems like dangerous business for an 11-year-old.
It's not so bad. Not usually. And I volunteered.
Jack did a take. Volunteered? Why would you volunteer?
To protect my family. My mom and little sister. They're the most important people in the world to me, so when I got the offer, I took it.
A pang went through Jack's heart. Protect them from what? Jamie shook his head, his cheek squishing against Jack's shoulder.
Same thing from before, and some other stuff.
Can't say, huh? Jack's brows furrowed. Then, is there anyone else with you? They're not making you do this alone, are they?
I'm not alone. I have my mentor, and once things are safer, I can visit my family again.
Jack felt a deep ache in his chest, his heart going out to the little boy on his back. It was amazing how much courage could be held within someone so small. He bumped Jamie's head with his. See? You're braver than you think. That's incredible, Jamie. Jamie bumped him back.
How did you get involved?
They didn't tell you? Jamie shook his head again. Jack sighed. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. All that the people from the island said was that I was chosen, whatever that means. Apparently they'd been watching me for a while, but they only decided to show up after I nearly... He cut himself off. After I saved my sister.
You have a sister, too?
Jamie gasped, which became a yawn. A younger one, yeah. Jack smiled. You would have gotten along with her. You two are just alike.
Then she must be way cooler than you.
Jack jostled him again, mindful to be gentle with his sleepy state. Jamie was so tired that he hardly reacted outside of a small giggle.
What did you save her from?
That's not something I... Jack trailed off.
Does it have something to do with water?
Jack almost dropped the branch. What?
You said you grew up by the lake, Jamie continued drowsily, and asked me about the lady. So I thought, with your reaction to the dowsing rods...
He blinked a few times, jolting awake.
So, sorry, you don't have to talk about it. I didn't mean to...
Whoa, slow down. I'm not mad. You're really smart, you know that, Jamie? Jack looked away. It was, drowning, yeah.
Oh, sorry,
Jamie gasped.
But the spell, should we...
Don't worry, I can handle it. Jack smiled. Let's focus on getting you home safely. Jamie nodded. They walked in silence for a while.
That makes sense, though.
Jack snorted. What, me drowning?
Not the drowning part, just...
A pause.
You're a great older brother,
Jamie mumbled into Jack's neck. Jack's smile turned fond. Right back at you. Your sister's very lucky to have you. He bumped his head again. Little brother. He felt Jamie smile against his neck. He hugged Jack a little tighter. So how did you meet your mentor? Jack asked. Jamie grinned and brought a finger to his lips. Of course, Jack chuckled. Suddenly the dowsing rod dipped towards the ground. He and Jamie shared a relieved look. They found a vein. There was water nearby. Toothless continued his strange treasure hunt, traveling what must have amounted to miles hunting the floating shimmers that were few and far between. Every time they found one, Toothless would breathe fire beneath it until it disappeared from sight. Hiccup's only reassurance that they weren't leaving an easy trail was that the shimmer's location seemed to be at random, seeing how frequently Toothless changed direction in between. Maybe he was intentionally leaving evidence to throw the hunters. At this point, Hiccup was just grateful that the ground was too wet to start an accidental forest fire. Just to be safe, Hiccup managed to convince Toothless to at least hide the burned patches with some damp soil and fallen leaves. While Hiccup did his best to stay on the lookout, he couldn't help but admire the surroundings. The glow of the forest was in a constant flux. One moment the plants would shimmer with ethereal light, one by one, like stars appearing in the night. The next, they would dim all at once, like all of the forest was taking a slow, collective breath. But despite how beautiful it all was, after the 20th shimmer, Hiccup was running out of patience. Soon he was slumped forward in the saddle, his arms hanging limp by his sides, thumping his forehead against Toothless's neck.
Make friends with a dragon, I said. It'll be fun, I said. Surely you won't drag me around the woods at night for no reason, I said.
Toothless grunted in annoyance. Hiccup turned his head so that one cheek was smushed against Toothless.
Oh, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to distract you from whatever it is you're doing.
Toothless grumbled.
No, please continue. I'll just busy myself contemplating all my choices that led me to this moment.
He flopped onto his back, glaring at the sky in accusation.
Oh, how my life would be so much easier right now if I'd come to stop you yesterday. But no, I just had to have the common sense not to get struck by lightning. In hindsight, at least that would have been quick.
Toothless huffed, kicking up his hind legs and jostling him. Hiccup grunted as his head thunked back down on the saddle.
You could spare yourself from this.
Hiccup leaned up and dangled his head upside down right in between Toothless's eyes.
If you would just go back to finding what...
Toothless's pupils narrowed into slits. He suddenly sat up, smacking his head against Hiccup's. Before Hiccup could even complain, they were on the run again. Toothless wove through the trees with a renewed vigor, sniffing the air like it was tracking his scent. It was all Hiccup could do not to get hit by a stray branch in their path, listening to the rush of the wind past his ears. Then the rush seemed to be getting louder, coming from in front of them. Toothless burst through one last cloud of mist, arriving at the bank of a large river, the current rushing through its deep bed, filled with the previous night's rain. Hiccup blinked a few times in disbelief. Hopping off of Toothless, he went closer to the edge. In this strange, magical world, the water gleamed like quicksilver in the night. Just to be sure, Hiccup carefully scooped up a handful, mindful not to lean too far down, and brought it to his lips. It was fresh water, clean and pure.
You did it! Oh, thank the gods that's over. You really came through, but now we just need to find a good cave or, worst case, dig a hole. Whoa!
Toothless was bumping Hiccup with his head, nodding at the river.
Yeah, it's real. You did great, Toothless.
Toothless grunted. He almost sounded frustrated. He hopped onto one of the stones sticking out of the river. He kept looking down at the water, then towards the forest, crooning insistently. Hiccup didn't know what to make of it.
I'm not sure I follow, bud.
Toothless let out another grumble, and in his annoyance, his tail lashed at the water. After Jack alluded to what happened at the lake, Jamie took the hint that he wasn't eager to revisit his past. Instead, Jamie shared more about his own family. Jack learned that Jamie's mother was a weaver, in every sense of the word. She created rich tapestries of stories just as beautiful as the ones she spun from her loom. She was writing a novel in her free time, and to help out, Jamie was going to tell her all about his adventures in the magical world. Jamie's little sister, Sophie, was only 4 years old. Her favorite colors were pink and blue, and her favorite animals were bunnies. Jack joked that she might change her mind after meeting a certain other bard, and that she loved to go searching for unicorns, even if there was no way they'd be found in the middle of a small village. Jamie was in the middle of telling Jack that he was trying to convince his mentor to introduce him to one when they stepped into a wide, open glade. It was filled to the brim with ferns and thrush and dotted with white flowers. The dew on the floor twinkled under the moon, small droplets rising into the air as if to join the stars in the sky. Across the glade was more forest, obscured by the tallest wall of mist Jack had seen yet. From beyond the woods they heard a new sound, a faint rush like that of a flowing river. If Jack wasn't mistaken, he might have even caught a splash.
"We're almost there!"
Jamie cheered. He hopped off of Jack's back and grabbed his hand, pulling him towards the sound. Jack gave him a strained smile, doing his best to keep his anxiety down. This was a good thing. They needed it to get home. The more water, the more powerful Jamie's spell would be. However, he couldn't quite shake this foreboding feeling. It didn't have anything to do with the water, and it only grew worse the closer they got. He felt like... Jamie was fully awake, bouncing in excitement now. He let go of Jack's hand and ran ahead. It felt like... Come on! Like there was someone else beyond the trees.
Jamie, wait!
Toothless's pupils narrowed to slits, and he crouched down on the stone, letting out a low growl. Hiccup took a few startled steps back.
Toothless, what's wrong?
Toothless growled again, and Hiccup realized it was directed towards the woods behind him. He turned and scanned the gaps in the trees. Was it the search party? Or was it something else? A new threat from the strange, magical world? It was too dark to see. Hiccup didn't know who he should be preparing to defend, Toothless from whoever was coming, or vice versa. His fingers twitched restlessly at his sides. He wished he'd brought his sword. He shouted when Toothless came up from behind and scooped him up with his head, flinging him clumsily back into the saddle. Hiccup landed on his stomach, half his body hanging off the side and facing the wrong direction. Toothless didn't wait for him to adjust before taking off back into the woods, running straight into the clouds of mist. Hiccup groaned, thumping his forehead against the saddle.
Toothless, what are you doing? We literally just solved all our problems.
Jamie stopped right at the edge of the mist. A shadowy mass was rapidly emerging, dwarfing a small silhouette. He turned back to Jack, eyes wide with fear. Jack dropped the dowsing rod and ran forward, scooping Jamie off the ground just as he held his arms out to Jack. Now the whole wall of mist was coming after them too. Wraith-like tendrils of mist surrounded them on either side, leaving little option but to run back. Jack dashed across the glade as fast as he could while carrying Jamie, but the mist was converging on them until it blocked their path. The shadow was almost on them, a great nimbus surrounding the entity hidden within. Out of options, Jack crouched down, hugging Jamie close and shielding as much of his body as he could with his own, waiting for the hit. It never came. Out of the mist reached a hand, then the head of a horse, until a tall figure made completely out of silver stepped out from the larger cloud, followed by a silver mare. Something was off about them. Their strange robes were patterned with unrecognizable symbols to Jack. Long hair framed faint markings on their cheeks, patterns reminiscent of twisting vines and woven knots that shone when they tilted their head. Most unnerving, their eyes had no irises, their round surfaces shining like two mirrors. It shouldn't be possible, but it was, because they weren't human. This was one of the Fae. They're real. Jack stayed frozen in place. The fairy and their horse were standing right beside him and Jamie, their eyes surveying the area before them. Their gaze drifted over to where the two of them were, staring right through them. Jack held his breath. Their eyes glanced away like the boys weren't even there. The fairy scanned the glade for another beat, then looked behind them and spoke, or at least Jack assumed they did. No sound came from their mouth. Then they turned and began walking forward, leading their horses by the reins. Mist trailed after them, tapering off from their flowing clothes.
"But there aren't supposed to be any this far from their forest," Jamie whispered.
Then he gasped, and Jack followed his gaze. His breath caught. From all sides around him and Jamie, more and more silver fae stepped out from the mist. Young and old, they moved with an unearthly elegance. Some rode on horseback, and many carried strange instruments that they silently played. They were accompanied by apparitions of animals, deer, foxes, rabbits, birds of all kinds, and many, many more, all of which followed beside them without fear. Every one of the Fae had features that marked them inhuman, each unique to the individual. Some had the scales and gills of a fish, while others had feathers that lined from the tips of their fingers to those of their ears. Some seemed to be flesh and blood, and others made from flowers and earth. Some looked solid, while others had liquid forms. A few of them looked close to human, until a thin membrane blinked from one side of their eye to the other, or you noticed that they weren't walking, but floating across the grass. One looked in Jack's direction, and he caught a smile that showed off far too many teeth, all razor sharp. A pair holding hands walked right into them, only to dissipate into mist, the water droplets ruffling Jack's clothes before reappearing on the other side, never breaking stride. Neither of the Fae seemed to have noticed. Just as the first fairy, none paid the two human boys any mind. Standing at its heart, all was silver under the moon as the spectral parade passed them by.
"Are they real?"
Jack whispered.
"I think they were," Jamie replied. "At least, once."
"Time passes differently in the other world," Jack remembered him saying. Surely that didn't mean backwards. As more Fae stepped into the glade, Jack realized that every one of them was formed from the silver wall of mist behind them. Jack looked for the dowsing rod, but the layer of mist over the ground was too thick. The rolling clouds were encroaching on them still. If they were caught in it, Jack wasn't sure they would ever find their way out. "I guess we should follow them," he said.
"Are you sure that's a good idea?"
asked Jamie. "Not really, but I don't think we have a choice." Jamie nodded, hugging Jack's arm. Jack pulled him close, and they trailed after the Fae. Toothless sliced through the mist, running so fast that the droplets felt like pins against Hiccup's skin. He squeezed his eyes shut and held onto the saddle, waiting until he felt Toothless burst through a clearing and finally stop. Hiccup's heart dropped as he took in the familiar grove of burnt trees. They were back to where they'd started.
"Why did you bring us back here? The search party's going to find us any minute."
Toothless was more agitated than ever. He paced around the clearing, flicking his ear fins when Hiccup tried to calm him down. When Hiccup gave up and jumped off the saddle, Toothless turned back and bumped him insistently with his head. Hiccup pushed him away, planting his feet firmly on the ground.
"Now, that's enough. Whatever you're trying to do, whatever reason you have for bringing us to this other world, It can wait until we've found a new hideout. Far, far away from the people hunting you. You're in danger, Toothless. Why can't you see that?
Toothless let out a frustrated growl. He arched his neck and his mouth filled with sparks. Flicking his head up, he shot a bright plasma blast into the air of the clearing, illuminating the surrounding trees. It was the first time Hiccup had paid attention to the burns on the upper canopy. A lot of the damage was undoubtedly Toothless's doing. Hiccup had bribed him into enough experience with his plasma blasts to be able to tell. But there were some burns that he didn't have an explanation for, like the seared grooves that were carved too deep for licks of flame, or the branches that looked like charred skeletons, as if they'd been incinerated from the inside out.
You didn't do this, did you?
He met Toothless's eyes.
Is that what you were trying to tell me?
Toothless crooned. Hiccup put a hand on his head, and he leaned into the touch.
Then what?
Suddenly Toothless's eyes snapped open again. His ear fins flattened against his head, and he bared his teeth, letting out a deep, rumbling snarl. Hiccup jerked his hand back, feeling the instinctual, animalistic fear ignite in himself. He hadn't heard Toothless sound like this since they first met, and certainly never directed back at him. The longer they followed the Fae, the more Jack noticed the somber note in their parade. Even in the silence, he knew the musicians played slow and soft as they swayed. Sometimes a fairy would draw unseen lines on trees or stones, their caress reverent and touch lingering. And they were singing, all of them were singing, to each other, to the animals, and to the earth and sky around them. Jack watched as the fairy pressed his forehead to the trunk of a large willow tree, whispering something before forging on. He felt a pang of recognition in his chest.
It's like they're saying goodbye.
Jamie let out a soft gasp.
This must be when they all left.
Left Burke? The look Jamie sent him was filled with a sadness too heavy for one so young. It was a mirror image of the melancholy in Nimwe's eyes back then, when Jack asked her what magic was left in the world.
Home,
Jamie replied, and the symphony of all the Fae's song could be heard through the word. Jack's throat felt tight. He didn't look at their faces from then on. Instead, he tried to see what sort of marks they were tracing. But the trees had since grown, the gnarled bark obscuring whatever they'd drawn, and the stones were weathered out of their spectral reach. How long ago was this? Jamie paid close attention to the drawings as well, mimicking their movements in the air. He shook his head.
Really, really long. I don't recognize any of these symbols.
They were so engrossed in deciphering the drawings that they bumped, or faced, into one of the Fae. Jack got half an apology out before remembering that they weren't actually there. All at once, the movement so elegant that it felt rehearsed, the parade came to a stop. At the head of the group stood a tall fairy man with hair that fell down his back nearly all the way to the ground. Half of it was tamed into braids, while the rest flickered like flames around his head, atop of which sat a circlet. He waved his hand, and the mist around them rose in front of him, swirling until it formed a large gateway. And once again, with inhuman unison, the Fae moved forward, gliding after the leader through the threshold. Jamie made to follow, but Jack tucked him back to his side. Something told him that if they stepped through that gate, there really would be no coming back. One by one, they watched as the Fae and their companions returned to the mist from which they formed. At the very last moment, when the rest of the group had vanished into the brush, a little fairy girl turned around. This was a vision from the past, but Jack couldn't help feeling her stare as he met her eyes. The little fairy took one last, long look into the forest. Then she turned and drifted into the gate. The wall of mist rose up behind her, and with that the Fae were gone. And the explosions began. Hiccup flinched away as a plasma blast flew off into the distance, narrowly missing him by a breath. It lit up a bright path into the trees, exploding somewhere in the distance. Toothless snarled again, his head thrashing side to side. With another growl, he took off.
"Toothless, wait!"
Toothless ignored him, bounding into the woods, his dark scales blending in with the night. Without a second thought, Jack took Jamie's hand and dashed into the opposite direction.
"What was that?" "I don't know."
Jamie stumbled as he was cut off. Jack caught him before he could trip and pulled him closer.
"Is it the Fae?" "No, they'd never come back."
"Well, what else could it be?"
"The only other things that have this much firepower are dragons, but..."
That one sounded too close. Jack thought he might have heard a faint snarl. So a dragon. Well, if there was ever an ideal place to be attacked by a dragon, it would be Berg, filled to the brim with dragon-slaying knights. Oddly enough, Jack was relieved. It didn't last long. Jamie almost tripped again while shaking his head.
No, that's impossible.
Why?
The dragons all vanished hundreds of years ago. No one's seen them, even in the enchanted forest.
This time Jack was the one who stumbled. Then what? Jamie shook his head helplessly.
There shouldn't be anything this powerful out here.
Jack felt his blood run cold as the icy water. Images flashed in his mind too fast to stop. Black eyes, dark flames, cacophonous whispers. What? The bone-chilling smile.
What's wrong?
This horrible overlapping voices saying,
Jack!
Jack was rattled by a harsh tug on his shirt. He blinked away the spots in his vision to see Jamie's terrified eyes. He was clutching Jack's sleeve tight as he put his whole body into shaking him. They'd stopped running. Jack looked over his shoulder and caught a flash of light in the distance. Then another, and another headed towards... Jamie, get down! With no other option, Hiccup ran too. Hiccup could only see Toothless when he let another plasma blast loose, his body silhouetted by the flames. He followed after those lights, then when they got too far to see, the sounds of the blasts. But the booms began to echo further and further away. The fog surrounded him, growing denser. The forest thickened, and its shadows with it. Hiccup was left stumbling alone in the dark, with nothing but a vague direction to run and his spiraling thoughts for company. What was attacking them? Had the other dragons finally come to take Toothless home? Regardless if they hadn't, Toothless could enter the magical world whenever he wanted. So why was he staying out here in plain sight? Was it Hiccup's involvement that was keeping him trapped in the human world? Guilt wrenched in Hiccup's heart. Of course it was his fault. He was the one who trapped Toothless on the ground, and he was taking far too long to fix his mistake. Maybe Toothless simply got tired of waiting, and left without saying goodbye. The forest was starting to look blurry. Hiccup swallowed, wiping his eyes. He ran faster. Jamie was shaking him again.
Jack, wake up!
Jack coughed and pushed himself off the ground. He'd managed to grab Jamie and dive out of the way of the blast. He'd also had the foresight to cover Jamie's ears while doing so, and the echo of the explosion was now ringing in his own. Jamie was faring better, as far as Jack could tell. He was seeing double. The shaking wasn't helping. He met Jamie's gaze and put a hand on his shoulder. I'm all right. Don't worry. Jamie's eyes were a little too shiny, and he sagged against Jack, burying his face in his chest. He let out a breath that was so dangerously close to a sob. Jack felt the sound go through him, directly into his heart, twisting it painfully. He needed to get a better grip on those memories. He'd almost cost him and Jamie their lives. He hugged Jamie closer and rubbed soothing circles on his back. I'm sorry for scaring you. Jamie sniffled and nodded. Jack looked up to see a gaping hole in the stone they'd been in front of, its edges still cindering. Could the creature's fire do this? Jack had only ever seen what its black flames did to trees, but maybe they could also be concentrated into... Jack heard the crunch of dry leaves. He staggered to his feet, pulling Jamie behind him. Jamie looked up with wide eyes, and Jack held her finger to his lips. The two of them crept backwards until their backs hit the trunk of a large oak tree with large gnarled roots growing out from the ground. Quick, in here! Jack pointed out a gap in the roots, and Jamie crawled in, barely squeezing through. Jack crouched protectively in front of the opening, training his ears on their surroundings. The footsteps were getting closer, and if Jack was seeing right, there was a blurry silhouette making its way closer to them. More shadows, more trees, more speckles of glowing plants and ethereal mist. Hiccup ran and ran until... Was he hearing right? Yes, footsteps, rustling the ferns nearby. A shadowy silhouette was coming into view as he got closer. Hiccup stopped, his heart leaping into his throat. Toothless? He dared to whisper. A whisper in return. Two voices, distinctly human. Over by, heard explosions. Never seen, some kind of animal. The search party. The footsteps encroached on them from all sides as, to Jack's horror, the one silhouette split into many. Shadows formed a line as they moved, like an oncoming wave creeping up the shore. Jack nearly jumped at the gasp behind him.
"There's water in here!"
Jack looked, and sure enough, he could just make out the edge of a small pool in the moonlight. "Will that be enough for the spell?" Jamie stuck his hand in. The water barely came above his wrist. His shoulders sagged.
"Not even close."
Jack felt a scrap of hope fizzle out, and replaced with a spike of fear from another explosion. The figures in the distance were clashing with each other. No, there was a new member amongst the ranks, and the rest of the group converged solely on that one. Jack was thankful for the heavy mist between their two factions. The light from the fires would have immediately exposed him otherwise. As of now, they were only close enough to dimly light up their hiding spot. It shone off the surface of the pool, making it look like a mirror. Jack got another idea. Jamie was already moving out from under the roots before Jack stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "You said you can use pools of water like portals, right? Is that one big enough for you to fit through?" Jamie's eyes flickered to the pool, then back to Jack, whose arm and shoulder were all he could squeeze through the gap.
"Yeah, but—"
"Then go." Understanding passed over Jamie's features. He put a hand over Jack's, clutching it close.
"No, I don't even know if it'll be strong enough."
Jack's heart caught at the stutter. He squeezed Jamie's shoulder. "I'll buy you some time. Leave those things away. If they're distracted chasing me, you might be able to break through the block in the veil."
"But how will you get out?"
"Good question. I'll find another rift." Jack feigned a confident shrug, giving him a smile. "Race you there." He turned away before—
"You promised we'd stay together."
Jack froze. The look Jamie was giving him tore at something buried deep within Jack's being. The plea in his eyes, brown as Jack's own, was too familiar. Everything about this night had been all too familiar. Jamie read something in Jack's eyes as well. A new determination settled into his.
"I'll use it to strengthen the mist spell."
Jamie moved so that he was holding Jack's hand in both of his.
"I'm not leaving without my lion."
Jack felt something flicker awake inside of him. He'd gotten so used to its absence that its warmth took him off guard. It was like a little candle had been lit. One of the street lamps in Hawthorne returned to him from the night he'd left. "All right, Yvain. Together." Jamie visibly relaxed, settling back under the roots. He brought his pendant out, still holding tight onto Jack's hand. Jack adjusted his crouch so that he could shield Jamie while holding on, giving Jamie's hand a reassuring squeeze. Jamie turned his attention to the pool. His eyes began to glow, the same color filling the spirals of the Triskele. The water swirled, languid and hypnotic. The edges of the pool seemed to blur as water turned into mist, thick coils rolling out in a ring. Jack turned his eyes back on the forest. The figures in the distance seemed to have calmed down. Most had disappeared once again. All but one. He and Jamie would only have one shot at this. "On my signal, we make the doorway and run," Jack murmured. Jamie squeezed his hand. The last shadow sat in a low prowl towards them. This time, Jack stared it down. Hiccup rushed to duck behind a large bush as more guards stepped out from the trees. All of them were armed with bows and arrows, with swords at their waists and spears in their hands. The light from their torches made the chains they carried gleam and highlighted the metal traps and spikes that had undoubtedly been setting along their way. They fanned out, combing through the brush, and Hiccup scrambled further behind the bush until his back hit a tree. It rustled the leaves, and the guard turned at the sound. Hiccup pressed himself up against the trunk, but there was nowhere left to hide. Every footfall on the grass pushed his heart lower, and each wave of a branch that was pushed aside sent a matching wave of despair to fill its place in his chest. It was agonizing how slowly the guard pushed aside the last branch between them, bringing her torch so close to Hiccup's face that the heat stung at his skin. When his vision adjusted to the light, he was eye to eye with the large Burkian guard. No, he couldn't be caught now. Not when Toothed was still being hunted, not when he still couldn't fly. Hiccup still had to— "Nothing here too, sir." "What?" The guard stood and moved away, letting the branch fall and obscure Hiccup again. Hiccup stayed stone still. There was no way she missed him from a mere foot apart. Was she covering for him? No, she barely spared him a glance. The guard looked like she hadn't seen Hiccup at all. It was like he was invisible.
"Keep looking,"
ordered another voice, more stern than the others, more commanding. The blood drained out of Hiccup's face. What was he doing here? The timing couldn't be any worse. "These tracks are fresh. Whoever's done this can't be far." Hiccup took off. He didn't know what to make of his new invisibility, and probably should have been more concerned about it than he currently felt, but just because they couldn't see him didn't mean the same applied to his friend. Hiccup fled through the brush without bothering to muffle his footsteps. Hoping to both find him and lead him away from the guards, Hiccup called out with desperate abandon, "Toothless!" The shadow stalked towards them at an infuriatingly steady pace. At this distance, Jack could see its gait was animalistic, a predator on all fours. Jack felt his legs start to jitter and clamped his hand down on his thigh. He was so tempted to cut their losses and call it now, but he wasn't going to gamble Jamie's life on impulse, not without certainty that the spell would work. Jamie squeezed Jack's hand again. He'd gathered up all the mist that he could. Jack could feel the cool vapor against his skin. One opening. That was all they needed. One moment of hesitation from... The shadow jerked upright, turning its head as if it heard a call. "Now!" Mist billowed out from the roots in rolling waves. Jamie wriggled out from under the roots and swept his arms up, commanding the mist to rise in a large wall in front of them. Jack heard a snarl come from the other side of it. Now or never. "Let us out!" Jamie commanded. The mist took on a blue sheen. Jack took Jamie's hand and ran forward, only to stumble back when a massive silver wolf leapt out from the cloud. Jack threw himself in front of Jamie as the wolf's maw opened over their heads and faced right through them, its fangs and claws dissipating into mist. Another vision. Yet the snarl they'd heard was very real. The cloud was collapsing in on itself, its mist blanketing the earth as it melted with the fog around them. "We have to keep moving. Jamie, stop the spell." I can't." Jamie's eyes were brown, and he was shaking his pendant as if he could wake it up, just like he did with Jack. A silver bear appeared from the side, claws out and barreling at them. Jamie cried out as the vision phased through him, and Jack lifted him into his arms. Jamie hugged him around his neck and buried his face into his chest. Jack frantically tried to find his bearings, but it was no use. Visions were pouring out in droves. Clashing swords and broken shields, children playing in a meadow, a stranger leading 2 stags, a convoy of knights riding into the unknown, 6 fairies with spears of wood and trapping a lone man, a flock of wild geese taking off, 2 lovers sharing a kiss. Jack couldn't tell the stories apart. The characters faced into each other as they moved, melding together and molding into entirely new beings, phantoms from across centuries interwoven. The search party was right on top of them, Toothless was still on the loose, and Hiccup probably passed that burned tree about 3 times. If the gods wanted to throw another fun challenge at him as a joke, now would be a good... "Oh, son of a half-troll!" Hiccup cursed before he was swallowed by a thick wall of mist. He staggered back at the rush of humans and fae and griffins and serpents and boars and wisps and so many more, all made of the very mist that engulfed him. Were they ghosts? Illusions? Hallucinations, maybe. Probably. Hiccup wouldn't be surprised. His sanity had had a good run. He was impressed it held out as long as it did. That would explain why the beings he was seeing were all silent as the night. So it was to his utter relief when he heard a familiar, rumbling snarl. He turned to see a dark shadow amongst all the silver racing towards him, its green eyes nearly glowing and its mouth filled with sparks. "Stop!" Toothless's pupils went round, and he jerked his head to the side. The plasma blast flew past Hiccup's head, the wind from it ruffling his hair and clothes, cutting through the mist and all the ghostly figures in its path. It exploded into a hawthorn tree, blowing half the branches off and lighting up the trunk into flames. The forest went deathly quiet. All at once, the glow of the plants vanished, and the shadows became impossibly dark, until the only source of light came from the fire. Out from the roots of the tree, lines of green light flowed, igniting ancient runes surrounding the ground around Hiccup and Toothless. The ground seemed to shift, and Hiccup found himself plummeting into the shadows. Overwhelmed by the visions, Jack carried Jamie back step by step until they were pressed against the trunk of... Suddenly the misty figures were illuminated in light, hues of blue, green, and gold. Jack looked around to see that its source came from the tree behind them, the cracks in the bark lighting up to reveal lyrical lines interlaced into knotted symbols.
"The face drawings," Jamie gasped. "The magic still works."
Jack warily eyed the glowing lines. "Is that a good thing?" The light flowed into a spiral around their feet, and the roots shifted to follow its shape. The earth fell away, and a chasm opened beneath them. "Hang on!" Jack shouted, and the two fell into the darkness. Hiccup landed on his stomach with a hard whoomp and a pained wheeze. He clutched his gut and slid off the saddle, down the smooth black scales, landing on his rear on the ground. Wait, the saddle, the scales. "Toothless!" Toothless ducked his head down to meet Hiccup's eyes, his pupils round and full of worry. Hiccup's vision blurred, and he smiled so wide it hurt his cheeks. That was good. That stopped his lips from trembling. He let out a watery laugh and hugged Toothless's big old dumb head, burying his face in his scales. "You came back," he breathed. "I was so worried." Toothless let out a low croon and nuzzled Hiccup's face. Then he pulled back and roared, shooting a plasma blast over Hiccup's head. Something screeched behind Hiccup, and he turned to see a large root that would have speared him, rearing away from the impact. It fell away from them, crashing back down to the earth. Hiccup winced at the resulting boom. All this noise was bound to attract the search party's attention. He wasn't sure how far the forest had taken him and Toothless, but there was no way they didn't hear that. Hiccup took in their surroundings. They had landed in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by a wall of willows, hawthorns, and oaks. Large boulders glowed with ancient runes, and the vines and roots shifted menacingly around them. Toothless stood protectively over Hiccup and snarled in challenge, and all of the forest attacked. Jack tucked Jamie close and managed to grab hold of a stray root on their way down to break their fall. He dropped down and rolled before hopping back to his feet, helping Jamie up as well. The tunnel of roots spiraled close behind them, leaving them in a completely new part of the forest, filled with glowing ferns and shifting vines, and, of course, the ever-present mist. Jack got another idea. "Do you think you can do the mist spell again?" he asked Jamie. Jamie's brows pinched together.
"Yeah, but what if it brings up more of those visions?"
"That's what I'm counting on. Maybe we'll find one that leads us out of here. It's the best chance we got." Jamie grimaced, but he pulled out his pendant all the same. Jack pulled him to his side, ready to protect him from whatever the forest had in store. Jamie commanded the mist to rise around them. For one long beat, there was nothing but silence. Then the nightmare began. A silver knight in bloodied armor appeared from the side. He held a broken shield on one arm and a swinging halberd with the other, his mouth open in an unheard battle cry. More followed behind him, droves and droves of them, until Jack lifted Jamie back into his arms. "Close your eyes," he said, holding him closer. Jack would bear witness alone, because no child should have to see war. Toothless was in pain, and it was Hiccup's fault. He stayed by Hiccup's side, shielding him from the vines that threatened to strangle him and the thorns that shot at him through the air. He shot as many plasma blasts as he could without hitting Hiccup, and when the assailants were too close to Hiccup for the fire to be safe, he was left with nothing but his teeth and claws.
"Toothless, you have to run!"
Hiccup desperately tried to push him away.
"You can't win this fight!"
Toothless growled in response, knocking Hiccup back down behind him with his tail. Hiccup understood. The force was relentless in its attack, and to run would mean leaving their backs defenseless. Toothless couldn't move, and he wouldn't move, because Hiccup had no sword or shield, and he refused to leave Hiccup alone. Hiccup had trapped him yet again. Hiccup pulled at his hair. He tried to think of a way out, a strategy to free them, but there was nothing. This world was beyond his realm of understanding. The earth rumbled. The soil shifted, and gargantuan roots burst forth from beneath them. Toothless and Hiccup both yelped in shock. Toothless recovered first. He used his tail to force Hiccup to stand and scooped him off the ground with his head before sending him hurtling away from the center of the roots.
"No!"
Hiccup hit the ground just as the roots erupted from it, trapping Toothless in their grasp. They coiled and constricted around him, crushing and strangling his body. Toothless roared and shot plasma blasts at his cage, but vines rose up to muzzle his mouth closed. Hiccup looked frantically around for something, anything he could use as a weapon. The shine of metal caught his eye. The prototype of the tail fin had fallen out of the saddle and was lying a few feet away. Hiccup heaved it off the ground and charged. Soldiers clad in different armor from different eras all clashed together. Shields were bludgeoned and smashed. Weapons cleaved people open. The fallen collapsed in mangled heaps, then merged back with the mist to begin the cycle anew. Jack couldn't tell the factions apart, nor did it matter. All of the battles were savage, wretched, and filled with bloodshed. He swore he could hear the death throes as the silver soldiers slaughtered each other, every anguish-filled face burning into his memory. Was it any wonder why the Fae wanted nothing to do with their world? Jack swallowed back the bile in his throat and scanned the crowd for someone who wasn't in armor, who wasn't fighting, who wasn't dying. Only one stood out. Unlike the Fae from before, this person was distinctly human. From her clumsy movements to her openly expressive face, her eyes were wide with fear. She was tall and thin, with long features and high cheekbones. Her long, fine gown, the bodice and sleeves decorated in lace detail and jeweled clasps, was ripped and torn towards the bottom. She was missing one of her gloves, and her exposed hand was covered in scratches. Her hair was tied into 3 intricate braids hanging down her back, though they were all coming loose, with leaves and twigs caught in the strands. There was something familiar about her. Jack couldn't quite place it, but he felt like he had seen those same mannerisms before. Whoever she was, one thing was clear. She had been running for a long, long time. The woman stalled, frantically looking around her. Then she jumped and looked over her shoulder like she heard something. She set into a sprint, stumbling over invisible stones and roots long since overgrown. Jack ran after her. Hiccup swung the prototype like a club, beating away the branches that were about to pierce Toothless's wing. 3 tresses from a willow whipped at him, and Hiccup unfurled the tail fin, deflecting the blow with the leather webbing. Another root made to grab at him, and he sliced the fin sideways like a blade. As soon as one of the metal tips touched the root, it reeled back and slithered away. Hiccup furrowed his brows. He'd barely touched it. Above him, the roots had nearly overtaken Toothless's entire body. His roars and growls had turned into keens of pain. Hiccup saw red. He charged the cage. As he did, he tore away the webbing from the tail fin, leaving only the skeletal ribbing. He threw the leather into the wind, and his caution with it, enduring the blows and cuts he received until he stood over the largest of the roots that were tormenting his friend.
"Let him go!"
Hiccup brought the skeleton down, driving sharp ribbing deep into the bark. The plants let out what Hiccup could only describe as a scream. The roots and vines recoiled as if they'd been burned, and Toothless fell to the ground, free of his cage. Toothless rumbled a deep groan, his eyes blinking open. Hiccup was breathing heavily, a relieved smile forming on his lips. It was short-lived. The forest scream had dulled into an eerie whisper. The shifting leaves were like ghostly voices, speaking in languages Hiccup had never heard before, but echoed something familiar. They spoke one word at a time in a haunting chant. Ishnaran, Ishnara, Ishnarus, Hazarn, Eiron, Herin, Ayeren, Ayeren, Ayeren. Roots writhed around the tail-fin skeleton, snapping the rods apart. The connection between the languages dawned on Hiccup. They were ancestral to his own and to the land. Hiccup felt centuries of rage within them, all contained in one word. Iron. Thorns clamped down on Hiccup's legs. He cried out in pain. Picking up one of the iron rods, the edge now dull, he desperately bludgeoned the plants, but it was no use. Vines bound his arms and legs, and the roots caged him in. He gasped a last breath before they wrapped around his throat, all so he could watch the world go dark as they buried his face. They tore through the night, deep into an unfamiliar forest. The looming trees seemed to curve inwards over them, and the glowing otherworld went dark as they ran by, until the only light came from the silver wraith in front of them. Even with his experience in the woods, it was all Jack could do not to trip on the uneven forest floor. He didn't have time to look behind them to see what was coming, nor did he want to. But the shrieking air and booming explosions only seemed to be drawing closer. All of a sudden, the woman's body sank into the ground. Half of her came back up again, gasping for air, her hair plastered over her head, and her dress sleeves dripping with, "Look out!" Jamie shouted. Jack stumbled to a stop, feeling the front of his foot hanging off a grassy ledge. They'd found a river. Hiccup couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't see anything except the stars in his vision as his lungs begged for air. But he could hear a roar. It shook the air and rumbled the earth, and with it came the cracking of wood being torn apart. With each tear the roar grew louder and the pressure on his body lessened. Finally, Toothless ripped away the last of the roots that bound him, pulling Hiccup out from their grasp by the front of his shirt with his teeth. Once Hiccup was free, Toothless burned away the rest of his cage and pounced on the tree root, raking claw marks down the bark until it retreated for good. Hiccup fell down on all fours, coughing and gasping for air. Toothless nudged him with his head, crooning in concern.
"Thanks, bud,"
Hiccup said, his voice still hoarse.
"I owe you one."
Toothless gave him a deep, comforting rumble. The plants around them began shifting again, an ocean of vipers ready to strike. Toothless and Hiccup jumped into action. Hiccup swung himself up onto the saddle, getting used to doing so while Toothless was on the move. With Hiccup safely on his back, Toothless roared in challenge at the gnarled roots that still clawed for his friend. Above them the trees of the willow snapped like vipers. Thorns cracked out from the gaps in between roots and flew at them out from the hawthorns like arrows. They were surrounded. The forest itself their enemy, outnumbered, out of options. Except one. Fight. Hiccup's training in mounted battle kicked in. As with a galloping horse, he leaned forward and stood on the stirrups, keeping his balance while Toothless thrashed and leapt, breathing a column of fire around them. With the last iron rod, Hiccup struck the willow branches away and deflected the flying thorns, covering Toothless's back. One willow tress managed to snag onto the rod, but Toothless sliced it free with his tail. In turn, Hiccup struck back the roots that were about to trap their legs, riding on Toothless's side, holding himself up by his thighs and feeling the burn in his core. He didn't need to signal. Toothless knew to jump into the space the second Hiccup cleared it, snapping the last root with his teeth. For all their efforts, they wouldn't last long with Hiccup using a dull rod in place of a sword. The two of them shared a look, just a passing glance. That was enough. Toothless faced off against the roots and vines, clawing and biting and burning them out of their way. Hiccup only had to deflect the thorns shot through the air and focused on navigating them by nudging Toothless with his knees and leaning from side to side like you would with a horse. But a dragon wasn't limited to the forest floor. Even without flight, Toothless could climb the branches of trees, leap onto the tallest boulders, and crawl through the gaps in the roots. Sitting, crouching, sometimes standing upright, or nearly hanging upside down, Hiccup twisted and leaned far and wide in the saddle, fighting in ways that he could never before. This new dimension of battle allowed not only Toothless agility, but his ability to make his own decisions when Hiccups faltered. The forest that attacked them became their turf, and they weren't letting it trap them anymore. Arduously, they fought their way out from the center of the trees. Further and further they forged, until they neared the wall of gnarled trunks, vines, and thorns, coiling and twisting into an impenetrable barricade. And forward they charged. Hiccup had no lance, nor shield to which to mount it, but it didn't matter. Toothless shot a plasma blast sharper than any blade, piercing through the thick wood as a needle glides through silk. Vines and thorns began to fill the tunnel, so Hiccup threw the iron rod like a spear into the center. The ancient magic recoiled from the metal. In unison, Hiccup and Toothless tucked themselves as close together as possible. Toothless took one last leap forward. They sailed through the passage like an arrow loosed from a calm archer's bow. The two of them landed on the other side of the barricade just as the thorns snapped shut behind them. The vines called up to attack again, but they were already racing fast and far away. Hiccup knew they needed to be quiet, but he couldn't help giving a joyous cry into the air. Toothless let out a matching roar, and Hiccup felt the sound rumble through Toothless's body into his own. Two minds at work, two warriors' instincts, two hearts beating in tandem. Soon they would take to the skies as one. Jack stood frozen at the edge of the river, watching the rapids flood through the bank, crashing into the stones. The light of the other world gave the surface of the water a silvery, ice-like sheen. The woman was gone. Jack tried not to imagine what might have happened to her, what almost happened to him. He didn't know what was louder, the roar of the river or his thunderous heartbeat in his ears. Was the water level rising? Jack felt his own wave of memories rushing to meet him.
"Are you okay?"
Jamie asked. It sounded like a plea. It brought him back. Jack gritted his teeth and willed the memories away. Not trusting his voice, he jerked his head in a nod. He let Jamie down just as an explosion made the earth tremble. Jamie made a small, choked cry, and Jack caught him before he could fall. Still kneeling, Jack placed his hands on Jamie's shoulders. "Hey, you can do this." Jamie made his gaze.
"So can you."
Jack swallowed thickly. He gave Jamie what he hoped was a reassuring smile and nodded. Jamie pulled out his pendant. He began to chant, slow and quiet at first, then faster and clearer. His eyes glowed ultramarine. Like ribbons of quicksilver, water from the river rose into the air, orbiting around them in thin rings. Another explosion sounded off, so close that they could feel the air rattle around them. Jamie faltered. The water around them stalled as the glow of his eyes dimmed. He stuttered to recover, and the water swirled once again, only to nearly splash to the ground as another explosion rocked the night. Jack could feel Jamie trembling. Gently, he pulled him into a hug, making sure to cover his ears as best he could. "It's okay. I'm here. I've got you." He felt Jamie take a deep breath. His chanting steadied, coming out more confidently than ever. The glow of the Triskele was blinding. River water rose faster in larger amounts. Ribbons into banners, strings into streams, droplets into gemstones, through which Jamie's light refracted, casting blue glowing rays on the ground and the forest around them. Then the glow was contained as the glimmering banner streams and gems enclosed them into a great sphere until all of Jack and Jamie's world was water. Jamie clung onto him, and Jack squeezed him back just as tight. The walls of water drew closer. Jack could see his reflection. He closed his eyes.